This is episode 73 of AA Beyond Belief, the podcast, and I'm your host, John S. In today's episode, we'll meet Serge Prengel, the author of The Proactive 12 Steps for Mindful Recovery. The Proactive 12 Steps are an adaptation of the original 12 steps that describe the steps as a self-directed process as opposed to a mystical process in which change somehow happens to you. Serge is a life coach and therapist who practices in New York City, and he has a website, proactive12steps.com, where he offers his book, The Proactive 12 Steps for Mindful Recovery, free of charge as a download PDF file. He also has videos that he publishes on a weekly basis, and you can subscribe to his newsletter to receive those. Without further ado, my conversation with Serge Prengel, The Proactive 12 Steps for Mindful Recovery. Serge, thank you for joining me. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
John, thanks for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
A couple of years ago, you wrote an excellent article on AA Agnostica about the Proactive 12 Steps, which is also a book that you have available in PDF format on your site, proactive12steps.com. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And not only do you have all of this information on your site, you've also made videos, which are actually very helpful for people that are interested in learning about this. Do you want to kind of give us an overview of maybe a little bit of your background and what led you to look at the 12 steps and to write them in this fashion, or to look at them in this way?
So maybe first a qualifier of what I'm not is I'm not somebody who's part of the 12-step culture. I don't have what would people qualify as an addiction, although on a continuum I certainly can identify with the continuum where people can have addictive behaviors. So I consider myself a human being on a spectrum, on a continuum, where the difficulty of the human condition can lead people to forms of suffering that include addiction. I am a therapist and a life coach, and I'm very interested in what it is that makes people change, including myself. And probably the reason I became a therapist and a life coach more than anything else is my own curiosity and stakes in figuring out how to manage my life in a way as to have as happy or contented or satisfied a life as possible and overcome problems and challenges. In that context, I have long been very interested in the 12 steps as a scenario, a narrative of what, liberation from suffering can be. And the sense that so many people over time have found a source of inspiration and actually practical growth in it. So I have tried to understand it, from this perspective for many years, as something that, had a depth and that needed to be better understood than simply believing that some miracle happens.
Right. So really looking at the process behind the actions that are taken through the 12-step process rather than, I guess, the belief component.
Yes. And so you hit on the key word for me is that sense of the process.
Right.
And I think for many people, probably the idea is the belief. And it's interesting that, the word belief, I'm not necessarily against it in the sense of, faith healing, because from a perspective that's religious, faith healing is something that comes from an outside source. But if you have a more humanistic perspective, a person-centered perspective, then even faith healing is something that's an inherent capacity of human beings. that has evolved through, millions of years of evolution.
Sure.
So the narrative of an outside force like God creating faith healing is simply a way to describe something that's a profoundly human phenomenon. And to the extent that we can understand that human phenomenon and harness it, for our own benefit, then it's great. There's no reason to shy away from it because it has been hijacked by people who put a certain interpretation on it.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? That's exactly kind of how I evolved with the 12 steps. I approached them originally probably from a more traditional perspective, I suppose, where I was maybe not a very deep believer. I was certainly trying to do that. But finally, after I came to the conclusion I was an atheist, which really wasn't that long ago, a few years ago, I really started focusing on the actions and the things that I did and how those actions impacted me. And all of a sudden, as I stood back, I could see that the belief wasn't that important. It was more what I was actually doing. And I could also see that I had a lot more in common with those people who did believe that there was a God. It was, as you said, the difference was in how we explained or described what was happening with us, the change that was going on with us. I would describe it in more practical terms, and someone else would describe it in more, in an amazed, miraculous type of a way, I guess.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I like the way you relate your story and you make the difference between before and the moment where you started to look at the world from a point of view of an atheist. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're saying is, as you no longer had the easy explanation that, God or some kind of supernatural force is doing this, then in a way it kind of forced you to look beyond that simple thing. And I think that then creates a deepening of the process.
Right. Exactly. It really does. In fact, that is the experience of most of the people that I talk to who have gone from working the steps as a believer to a atheist or agnostic, is that they are more meaningful because we have to stop and ask ourselves what they mean to us. In fact, a lot of us actually write them out in our own language before we start going through them. And, looking at your steps, I really enjoyed reading these. What I love about the steps is actually that they do require some thought, and I can take from my own personal experience of having gone through them, reading your words and relating it to what I've been through. And your description of step 1 was unlike anything I've ever seen before, but I think it really hits it right on the nail. Your step 1 is there is a big split between who I want to be and what I do. I am stuck in what I do. So can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit? What led you to see that step in that way?
Well, the thing that I really very much like about step 1 in all the traditions is the sense that it's the end of the road and it's the beginning of the road. That, you come to the inescapable conclusion that you have been trying to avoid seeing, that things are not working. But at the same time, this is liberating. This will turn out to be liberating. But the extent to which you are stuck is actually the extent to which you are going to be liberated. Now, what is the nature of that stuckness? And what has always amazed me about the steps, and I think the wisdom of the process that I like, is that, having talked about alcoholism, having alluded to it in the first step, you really don't talk much about it afterwards.
Right. That's right.
So that's that sense that, what is really happening is, of course, alcoholism or drugs or whatever other behavior is the presenting symptom, but that the underlying problem is actually that you lost yourself.
That's right.
And the reason actually that allows for, the miraculous intervention of God or looking for God as the only salvation is the sense of I've lost myself. And this is a problem which has no known solution other than God. And, if putting it into a different person is what does it really mean to have lost yourself? And so in a very practical way, what it is, who you are how do you define who you are? And is it who you think you are, or is it what you do? And there is a value to both. It's not just what you do. You take, for instance, somebody who's waiting on tables and is an actor, and defines himself by being an actor, and you can make fun of him for doing that. But it's also somebody who maybe is going to say 20-year waiting on table, and the spirit of what he's doing is going to lead him to find a great role and be an actor. Right. And he might never be famous, but maybe what makes him come alive is to be an actor. So I'm not necessarily putting down what you do, putting down who you think you are versus what you do. But the point is, at some moment you have a crisis in terms of saying, who am I? And that crisis is a big split, and is what makes it hard, in a way to find a solution to it, is you don't have a firm grip on, where you stand. Right. And so the magnitude of the question is what then launches you in a quest. And I think that's that quest that the process of the 12 steps is about. And most of us, all of us actually, in AA or NA or anyone that's suffering from an addiction, when they get involved with the steps, they do it out of some kind of, really serious crisis going on in their life. And there's a lot of fear, and some, probably some pretty, threatening issues, that are forcing a person to take this action. But now, after many years of sobriety, there are smaller issues where I might get stuck in my life. Maybe I get stuck at work or something, and I still use these principles and these steps to help get me unstuck. But I guess my question to you is, how would one who is not experiencing a real serious crisis, do you think that they would still find value in these steps in this process, and would they have the motivation? So the way we are is mindlessness is our default mode, and I'm not even putting it in a bad way, because in a way, why waste energy questioning something that seems to be working? So somebody whose life is going perfectly probably would not, because there's not a reason for it. But we're as human beings, we always have some sort of crisis or another. We always have difficulties adapting to the world. We live in a world, a modern world that is complex and full of pressures. And in addition to it, we evolved from a relatively simple environment of being in little tribes to a much more complex world. So, basically, life is constant crisis. And so chances are, there's nobody who really doesn't have a problem.
That's understandable. I think a lot of times, we in the program think that we're somehow different, that some sort of crisis led us to want to make this change. But that's probably just the human condition, that all human beings are going to have difficulties in their life. And it's kind of nice to have a way to recognize what's going on and then maybe doing something about it.
Yeah. And I want to be careful there, because in a way, if I just simply said that, especially being an outsider in a way to the culture, I would seem to be trivializing what the nature of the crisis that it can be that leads people to AA or NA or places like that. And I certainly am not, making this the equivalent of being stuck on, say, work issues or something of that nature. Right. But I see it as a continuum. I think that, and in my mind, the reason it is really profoundly meaningful to see it as a continuum is that it is not, treating the idea of addiction as something that's outside the realm of human experience. I think of it as very much something that is part of human experience, and that in a way, given enough pressure, probably most of us, one way or another, would crack under the pressure. And the forms under which we crack might be very different. But as human beings, if we have enough pressure applied to us, we crack. And so I think that is very helpful, that the idea is that, when you crack, you're not outside of the zone of human experience. You simply are at the edges where there is more pressure.
Okay. Yeah. Totally makes sense. So, as you go through this process, one of my favorite steps in the program actually is step 3, which I always saw as just making a decision to change. And the way that you have it written out here is I resolve to be more mindful of how I relate to people and situations. Pausing is how I do this, moment by moment.
Yeah.
So when you look at that, when you decided to, when you were working on putting these things together, what was your source material? Were you like reading the original Alcoholics Anonymous text? How did you come up with these thoughts?
I mean, first I would say that this is the 4th edition. Mm-hmm. And so, I started this dialogue with the steps maybe in 20 years ago.
Okay.
And it has gone through a lot of iterations. And, each step, not step in terms of the 12 steps, but of this process of writing the original proactive 12 steps, the various changes, was a mixture of paying attention to the original steps individually and as a whole, the commentaries that people may have written on them, paying attention to it in terms of my own life and also life of people I know and interact with personally and professionally in coaching, therapy. I started this as something that was essentially secular, and so with the process of demystifying the process by removing the presence of God in the steps, in order to see what was happening underneath, and not necessarily something that happened to people who are alcoholics or any addiction, but over time, as people who were in the program discovered the steps, and I've got some feedback from people about how they responded to it. This has also fed, how I've done it. Mm-hmm. So to make a long story short, it's really a process of thinking, paying attention to input of various sources in order to progressively come to an understanding of what it is that's happening.
Well, yeah, I think it's pretty amazing that you've been able to do this as you have. I mean, as I read through these, it's interesting because I've read the steps in a lot of different ways, that people have written, and maybe it's just my understanding them that I can somehow relate to almost all of them. But it's like I always get back to this thing of language. It's like we all go through this experience, and it's just different ways of describing it, and using this language will reach different people. Not everybody will respond in the same way to the same language. Mm-hmm. So I think it's good to have, all this different information out here, all these different ways of viewing things. And like we said before we started talking, that even you have evolved in your understanding of these things over time. I find interesting as well.
Yeah. So for instance, you were reading the 3rd step, mm-hmm. and so in some ways, in this version is a much more radical concept of proactive mindfulness at work. And so that instead of the concept of divine intervention, the concept of proactive mindfulness is, that mixture of wanting something, so having your eyes on the goal, but at the same time not having your eyes on the goal in traditionally driven slave driver type of approach, but more mindful, which is more gentle, more compassionate, so that there's this mixture of intentionality and awareness and compassion and self-compassion that comes in, and that concept that you can want to change your life, but what is actually happening? What is the mechanism that replaces, this miraculous intervention of God? And that proactive mindfulness is the act of, or the intention and the practice of looking at your life moment by moment and being able to see it with some clarity, and to see it with some clarity in such a way that you are able to start to see possibilities of getting off, the default mode, of finding, the fork in the road where you did not see it before. Mm-hmm. So kind of that gentle ability to slow down, and to see things. And that's where the concept of the pause comes in, because essentially until you pause, you are continuing on the same mode. Mm-hmm. And you pause and you have a moment, say, oh, wait a minute. Oh, and then, you can, reorient. So that's a big concept of, articulating how it is that these words of the steps are not just an intention, but that there is a built-in human mechanism that allows us to go through that.
I should have asked you from the beginning, your use of the word proactive. What are you talking about here? How is that different? And when you say the proactive 12 steps, mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
So originally, it started in reaction to the idea of, first, that there is a lot of wisdom in the idea of, say, the letting go, mm-hmm. Okay? But the letting go by itself, would, push to the extreme, would imply that you don't do anything. And the paradox is actually, what happens in the step is people do a lot of things and change a lot. Okay, so the idea is, so you let go, you refocus your attention on behaving better, and then as a reward, God rewards you with sanity. And in contrast, what I wanted to indicate is, no, you have a sense that you have a goal, that your life could be better, that you would have more of the life you want. So what you have found out is that by trying very hard and pushing, it's not working. But maybe there's another way to do it where you still take a central role in connecting to the sense of wanting what you want, in terms of having a better life. And you're able to make it happen. So I think the proactive by itself, in a way, needs to be corrected by the concept of mindfulness. That's why I refer to it as proactive mindfulness. So it's not just proactive in the sense of, say, I'm an army general and I say, I want this hill to be taken and I send my men there and you die if you need to be and go for it. And I've said it. Mm-hmm. It's a more gentle process that pays attention to what's happening, that tries to avoid unnecessary casualties, but it still is rooted in the idea that you develop a self. And I think that part of the health that's given by a process of change, such as the step, is to discover a new sense of self that is actually stronger than whatever existed before.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just talking to somebody from Refuge Recovery last weekend, and they use the concept of mindfulness in their process, and I think it's very valuable way to think about things. I guess I look at it as just kind of like somehow being aware. Is that how you would see mindfulness? Is like an awareness of like where I'm at or what's going on with me at any given time?
So yes, I would use. Yes. If I had just a simple yes or no, I would say yes to what you're doing, and I would want to expand on it.
Okay.
I like to think of mindfulness simply as the opposite of mindlessness. Oh. So not to make it that in order to qualify as mindful, you have to have been meditating 12 hours a day for the past 50 years, that kind of stuff. But really, essentially to say, mindful is simply the opposite of mindless. And mindless is nothing that's a flaw in character, but simply, in order to function, our mind needs to not deal with a lot of stuff that's unnecessary. Okay. Mm-hmm. So basically we have built-in mechanisms to not pay attention to stuff unless it's absolutely necessary, unless, there's something that calls our attention to it. So by definition, we're mostly mindless. And the mindfulness is simply developing the ability to create a little mini crisis, a little something that draws our attention on something that we don't necessarily pay attention to, but it would be helpful for us to.
Yeah. It sounds like it's something that requires some discipline and practice.
Yeah, but you'd be amazed how simple it is, because yes, practice, some degree of discipline, of intentionality,
right?
But so much less than, say, traditionally people think that, I cannot be mindful unless I practice mindfulness, which is that I'm going to sit every day for 15, 20 minutes, and do something that's divorced from my life. The practice here is simply to remember from time to time to pause, and so, for instance, I'm talking to you and I just am going to have a pause of a couple of seconds. You, as a listener, will barely listen that I have paused. But in that moment, it allowed myself to just turn a little bit the attention, say, hey, what's happening? I don't even have to ask myself that question. Simply by pausing, by stopping being, on bum, ba, bum, ba, bum, ba, bum.
Right.
I allow myself to have a little bit of input of what else is happening. Okay?
Yeah. The world that we live in is, we're always going from one thing to the next. We've got our cell phones, we've got our email, we've got our laptops, we've got the phones ringing, and there's just all this stimulus coming our way all the time. And, when I go to work, it's just constantly one thing after another. And not a lot of time to stop. And I think that would probably be a healthy thing to do once in a while, even if it's just for a second or two, just to stop and give myself that pause, I guess, to be aware of.
So yes, and what I want to do is to point out of how, the best way to go through that is to build on what you're already doing. So, for instance, you're a good interviewer, and the reason you are is because you pay attention to what's happening. You're not on one track of having a sense of what you're going to need to do, but you absorb, what the person who is interviewed is saying, and you adjust based on that.
Right.
Okay. So, in doing that, you cannot do that if you didn't have a little bit of a pause, an internal process. Okay, because you'd be totally on your track. And so, my point about the pause is it's not something that people, that I advise people to create out of nothing, but look in your own life in the ways in which you actually do that, because it's a very, very human capacity that we all have. And see how you're doing it. And just simply, once you notice that and you have the curiosity to notice it, you'll find that you extend it to more areas of your life.
Yep. Thank you for that. I'm not always such a great interviewer. One thing I've learned about in doing these podcasts, and now I've done almost 70 of them, I guess, is early on, I would listen to a recording of a conversation I was having, and I would notice, gosh, I didn't really listen to what he was saying, and I thought, how often do I do that in my life where I'm in a conversation, but I'm not really listening and paying attention to the person? And so in a certain respect, this has made me a better listener, but I'm also much more critical of my listening skills because I'm always making a mistake. But that's just something I've kind of gotten out of that, is that skill of listening is something I'm still trying to develop. It's not always
well, but I want to again highlight something you described this as being very much the process I'm describing. So you said early on in starting the process of interviewing people, you had some curiosity about how you performed, in a sense that probably you were not as good an interviewer, a good listener, and you started listening and noticing that. Okay? And so that's what proactive mindfulness is. That you say, I want to be better. What I'm doing, so very similar to step one. There's a split between who I want to be and what I'm doing. Like to be somebody who is a good interviewer and a good listener, somebody who's able to take in what people are saying. And, by facing the reality of listening to interviews, I'm noticing I'm not as much as I want to be, or not as good as I want to be. So how is it that I can change it? Okay. And that's where you started on the process. And so, what's happens is, we all have a built-in tendency to be more critical than need be. And I think that what is really good is to, and I think is part of the process of 12 steps. And the reason I like, pointing it out is that the traditional 12 steps cast the process in terms of sin and redemption.
Right.
So sin keeps you talking about defects of character and things about you doing wrong, and increase the cycle of self-blame, which is actually part of the cycle of addiction, whether it be addiction to substance or any other addiction that there is there's so much pressure on realizing how you're underperforming and how you're bad, that basically the only refuge you have is whatever gives you temporary comfort.
Yep.
And then you come back to feeling bad, and it fuels the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And so the mindfulness component is to realize, oh, I'm doing that, and this is a part of what I'm doing, and probably the reason I'm doing is I feel some pressure at that moment. And so the wanting to understand the pressure, and so very similar, I was pointing out something you had said before about how when you stopped being, believing in God as an explanation for the process, you were then freer to see other things. So when one stops being self-critical, one has room to actually see what is happening. Until then, being self-critical masks the process. So when you stop being self-critical, you realize, okay, so I feel under a lot of pressure at that moment. And what are the approaches that are going to help me deal with that? Mm-hmm. And I venture to say that, consciously or not, you landed on some form of pausing to give you some space during the interviews, because that's what you managed to do in order to actually listen to guests and to redirect the conversation in a nice way.
Yeah. You brought up a point there about how traditional, the religious view, I guess, of Alcoholics Anonymous or the 12 steps, it does kind of cast these things as character defects. There's something wrong with me and God will make things better. And I tell you what, I've actually been in meetings where I have seen people kind of use the steps to beat themselves up, and that's not what they were intended for. I think that there's kind of a fine line in being honest about yourself and trying to understand yourself and just beating yourself up. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how you would think a person would avoid falling into the trap of just beating themselves up, as opposed to just looking at those patterns of their life that they want to change.
So I think part of it is maybe the important first is to recognize it's happening, and to look that when you beat yourself up, essentially what is happening is that you put yourself outside of the realm of the okay people. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so essentially, when people do that, they accentuate the pattern of feeling, I'm an addict. So already there's a big loaded word compared to people who are sane. I have all of these character defects compared to people who are okay. Mm. And so there's a growing sense of isolation. And the growing sense of isolation that brings a growing sense of inadequacy, so therefore that's the opposite of having, connecting to what gives you power from inside. Mm-hmm. You're not okay. So from that place of not okay, it very much infantilizes you to the place where only something outside of you that's magnanimous and generous and, all-powerful can draw you out of that state of you're nothing to redeem you into being an okay human being. Okay. So in a way, it's part of the problem as opposed to the solution. And the solution is to, have the sense of course, no human beings is perfect. Far from that. We all have flaws, and you or I may have, flaws that are bigger than the average person. But the point about it is what gives us a lever, some kind of a grip on improving who we are is, standing on the firm ground of what is solid. And what is solid is to say, okay, so I want to go with the basic assumption that if I do some things that are beyond the pale, if I do something that are really bad, it might very well be because at that moment I'm experiencing such pressure that I crumble under it and I don't know how to handle it. Okay? Which is not how I want to be. And, but I'm not going to characterize myself as weak for that.
Right.
I want to understand better the pressure, because if I understand the pressure better, then I can deal with it better.
Right. This is really reaffirming because I kind of see myself sometimes doing just those things that you're describing. But I find that whole process of looking at the truth of the inventory process is valuable to me. Of all the tools I've ever learned in the 12-step process, it's probably been the inventory that has helped me the most because it does give me the time to really seriously look at what I am doing, how I am reacting to different things, and anything that I can't change, I kind of throw out. Anything I can change, I try to focus on. And it really does help kind of bring me into where I need to be and what I need to do.
Yeah. And so what you're saying is essentially the value of it is the sense that it brings you where you need to be. And so that's a good, it's a good benchmark. So when you do something, people do, and so we all have a tendency, again, as human beings, and the looking at ourselves, through centuries or millennia of civilization. Essentially, we learn to looking at ourselves just to be critical. Mm-hmm. Okay. But so the point, if you use the criteria of, is this actually helping me or not? At some point you think, it's so ingrained that it should be helpful that, it feels bad, but it must be good. Just like if the medicine tastes bad, it must be good. Mm-hmm. But you look at it and you say, well, actually what I'm noticing is when I beat myself up, it actually makes it less easy to make any changes. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's not a question of mollycoddling. It's just a question of finding the fertile ground on which it's possible to make changes.
Let's talk about these videos that you're making. So you're doing this now, and I signed up for your newsletter, so I get the newsletter that lets me know about your videos. But this is something new that you're doing, is that right?
Yeah. What I thought about is that a lot of these things are, a little bit difficult conceptually, mm-hmm. because when we deal with change, again, whether it be something really major, but even things that are less major, our default behaviors are behaviors that deal with taking a shortcut and avoiding moments of vulnerability. Mm-hmm. The reason we might be brusque or this or that or, whatever default behavior we have with people, is really a moment avoiding, the moment of vulnerability. So as a result, reading about something is not necessarily gut level in reaching you.
Right.
And what I wanted to do with the video is kind of communicate with people at a more gut level, a simpler level, and also visually show the difference in a felt sense of being stuck versus a felt sense of being unstuck. And so stuck being, I'm stuck in what I do, versus unstuck is I'm actually have a sense of flowing ease of, leading life the way I'd like to lead it. And to by showing it in an exaggerated form visually to help people notice it in themselves. And as you do, it gives you a very practical tool, moment by moment, to connect with that and say, oh, I'm in that kind of mode, and not, and show visually what happens, how you shift from one to the other. So it's not that there is a miracle that happens when you do that. It's not, like take 2 aspirins and you become a different person, but you start to recognize, the markers inside. And these markers are very personal. And as you have them inside, you have a benchmark to notice moment by moment, how you're behaving. And it gives you a compass, to orient your efforts.
Yeah. I was really impressed with, it's almost like, I wonder if you had some acting in your background, because you really did a great job with your body language and kind of demonstrating these principles as you were going through the videos. And I know that was intentional on your part, but I thought that was really amazing.
So I don't have an acting background, but in my work, I pay a lot of attention to embodied emotion, and so when I see clients, I have for many years had the habit of actually try to capture the sense of the dynamic that's happening either inside a person or within a couple, and to embody that by, miming it, by giving a visual representation of it, because essentially, seeing it is a much more gut level type of communication than describing it. Mm-hmm. And then people get it. And when you get it, then you're able to instinctively see how you relate to it and how you might want to change it.
It's interesting, these different ways of communicating. I noticed that also with podcasts. A lot of people love podcasts because they relate to the people in the podcast. There's something about when they hear their story through somebody else speaking it, it moves them in ways that the written word sometimes doesn't. And then if you add the visual component on top of that, where you actually get to see the human being move and expressions on their face and so forth, that adds another level of the communication. So it's nice that you add all of that together, and then you have a transcript with each of your videos as well. So, what are your plans going forward with this? What are you going to be developing this any further? Or
yeah, no, it is very much. It's a continued work in progress, but specifically at this stage, the borrowing a term from the software industry, what they call a new software, and when it comes out, they call it a beta version. Mm-hmm. So before it's officially released, people, a bunch of people try it, experiment with it, and to notice, how it can be improved. Mm-hmm. So that fourth edition is in a beta version, which means that, for the next couple of months, it's, intense period of taking input, feedback from people. I always do that. That's how they evolve from version to version. But specifically here, the final fourth version will be issued only in 2018 after taking into consideration input from people. Mm-hmm. So every week, a new step is released. People who want to be notified by it, subscribe to the newsletter, mm-hmm. and so that video of that step is released. And I love having feedback from people in terms of the specific step, the wording of the step, or the commentary on it, or the process as a whole as I describe it, or events in their life that relates to it, so that it can help get this a little bit more able to communicate with people.
Mm-hmm. And it's nice that you provide this service like this. This is a lot of work that you put into this. Is there something that drives you to want to help like this? Is there something in your background that motivated you to want to help people by providing all this information?
Yeah. So I think in a way, it's very similar to the spirit of the 12th step as I understand it. Mm-hmm. That, as you struggle with your issues and get a sense of liberation from them, and I don't mean liberation in the sense of being completely free of them, because we never can be, but there is more of a sense of wanting to share some of that with other people. And it feels good to do that. So as I mentioned before, I'm a therapist and a life coach, and as many people who become therapist or life coach, part of the motivation behind it has mm-hmm. been to understand better what drives me to feel better with my own struggles, and it feels good in that context to help other people. And I do this in the context of my work for which I'm paid. Mm-hmm. But there's also something that feels very good about spreading the ideas beyond what I could ever be able to achieve by seeing people one-on-one or in groups.
Yeah. Well, this helps a lot of people. Not everybody, of course, has access to the internet, but a lot of people do. And there's a lot of people out there that are searching for answers. They're searching for a solution. And even within our own community of, agnostics and atheists and AA, there's a lot of us who are just now discovering that it is possible to have a different interpretation of the 12 steps, to have a more secular view of them, or more humanistic approach. So all of this information is so valuable. In fact, when I shared this with our Facebook group, people just jumped all over it. They loved this. So this is amazing work, and it's good that you're providing this for people. I really thank you for doing that.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate it. And I very much appreciated how, you put some of yourself in the questions you ask. Mm-hmm. And so it made this conversation we had, I think, deeper and more satisfying.
Well, thank you very much. That's part of the AA culture, I think. We're always speaking from our own experience, and it's almost a bad habit sometimes. But yeah. Thank you for that. It's been a pleasure talking. Thank you for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly appreciate your support. If you have an idea for a podcast, or if you would like to appear on one of our episodes, please send me an email at john@aabeyondbelief.org. I'd be glad to hear from you. Also, if you can think about it, head on over to iTunes, and if you like what you're hearing, give us a positive review. That might help a little bit. If you don't like what you're hearing, if you have any critiques, send me an email. Let us know. We'll make a change. So again, I enjoyed it. We'll be back again next